Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. It's me, your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and in this next hour we're going to be speaking with Dr. Claude Swanson about subtle energy and the scientific evidence. But don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com. And you can sign up for our weekly newsletter at www.justenergyradio.com. You can also access all of our show archives. Let me tell you a little bit about Claude. I am just so excited to talk to him because, as you all know, I'm an energy girl. I do energy work and psychic readings and medical intuition evaluations, and he has been working on looking at the whole concept of subtle energy or chi from a scientific perspective. And there are so many people that go, oh, well, it can't be real because there's no science to support it. And I'm just really curious to hear what he has to say. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Claude, and we're going to get him on the air. For the last 20 years, interspersed with his conventional professional career in applied physics, Dr. Swanson has pursued investigations into unconventional physics. His principal interest has been unified field theory, the so-called theory of everything, which could explain the universe at the deepest level. This has led him to investigate many aspects of the paranormal which appear to be completely real phenomena which violate our present science. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Dr. Claude Swanson. Hi, Claude.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm great. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I am so glad to have you on. I've been looking for someone just like you to answer all of my sciencey questions. My background has been much more from looking at energy from a philosophical and from a experiential perspective. And here's your book, Lifefore, the scientific basis, that talks really about the whole concept much more from a scientific, like with tests and everything perspective.
Well, I have a dear friend out in Missouri who's been kind of one of my spiritual guides, I guess, over the years, and he's an energy healer, and he says, Claude, my patients are always asking me, okay, I can feel the energy, but what do you do? How does it work? And that was one of the motivations in doing this book. As a physicist, I went through a conventional education. MIT and Princeton learned how the current science believes things work, and I pretty much bought into all that. It's pretty convincing when you go through the program, but then afterwards I began learning about all the things you talk about, things involving energy healing. I began learning about remote viewing, the paranormal, and I realized that our current science is missing some really important pieces. My first book, Synchronized Universe, was an exploration of the paranormal, the evidence for these different things. The second book, Life Force, is trying to look into the science of energy itself. What makes up chi? What is this energy, and how can our science understand it and maybe expand to integrate it into our current scientific programs? That's what I'm trying to do.
But I think that's phenomenal because there's such a stigma, I guess.
Sure.
When you talk about anything in the, and I'm going to say generically paranormal, but, when you talk about energy medicine, when you talk about ghosts, where they say, well, you can't prove it. But in your book, you show case after case after case from a much more scientific, guys, there's like graphs and charts and bar charts and little diagrams showing all kinds of empirical evidence of change.
Well, that was the exciting thing for me when I began looking into, well, what's the scientific evidence? What's the proof for these different phenomena? Every one of these areas you talk about, which are stigmatized in a lot of the public media, when you actually look at the research, there is solid research for many, many things. There's been experiments as you probably know, at the Princeton Pear Lab for over 30 years, showing that remote viewing and ESP and psychokinesis, which is the mind over matter affecting things at a distance, these things have been proven in the laboratory. They're cumulative odds against chance, which is how they define, how realistic, how believable their results are. Odds against chance of trillions to one, which means that they're seeing effects that are genuine. So, and then recently, when I began working on the second book, I discovered all the work the Chinese have done in the past 30 or 40 years. The Chinese government has been studying qi, which is the same thing, really, as energy, as the energy we talk about in energy medicine or energy healing. There are qigong masters who can exert their energy thousands of miles away. They worked with physics laboratories in China. They changed things like the radioactive decay rate of certain radioactive elements. They bent laser beams. They changed the bonding properties of water. They did all kinds of things that scientists could measure in the laboratory. And so now we have a huge amount of evidence that qi, or subtle energy, or the life force, as I call it, it's a real force. It's not part of our current Western science, but it's real. And so it's up to scientists, if they're going to, be worthy of the name, to study these things and to develop a theory and to include it in our current Western science. And that's really what my book is a first step at trying to do. I first go through all the evidence for this force in different areas, in energy healing, in medicine, in sacred sites, and what the energy that you feel when you go to Stonehenge or Avebury or special crop circles. It's the same kind of energy. It's the energy that is really central to Oriental medicine. And so, we have to develop a theory for it, and the last chapter of my book is a sort of a first attempt at doing that. So that's what I've been trying to work on.
No, I think you have been working on it pretty successfully. From your perspective, I mean, you're a physicist, and I have to tell you, I've had other physicists on the show, and I always kind of get very glassy-eyed because I have no idea what they're talking about. I'm not glassy-eyed. I really appreciate this. But from your scientific perspective, what is subtle energy? How do you define it? How does science define it?
All right, let me try to take a deep breath on this one. In a sense, subtle energy came out of some of the spiritual work of the Theosophists, who were trying to interpret what the yogis of India were saying about subtle energy, because they were one of the groups that helped bring this knowledge to the West. In terms of energy medicine, of defining the aura, which is the energy field around the body, the chakras, things like that. The people who are energetically sensitive often can see these energy fields, and they use them as part of their healing. Of course, most of us can't, and scientists, are kind of in a way trained not to even believe in them. So it's been a process, but in a way, because this energy falls outside of conventional electromagnetism or the other forces that scientists learn about in school, it's been called subtle. It's hard to measure. It doesn't show up on normal sensors that we use to measure electric fields, for example, or magnetic fields. But it does show up in how the body responds. And it apparently is the energy that is really, it forms the pattern, the matrix that helps our body to grow, that tells our cells how to behave. It's the energy that healers work with. Unfortunately, because it can't be measured by the conventional means, it's been called subtle. In the last 30 or 40 years, I would say a real scientific knowledge of this energy has been evolving. And so now I can tell you that the Russians, for example, I talk about them in 2 chapters in the book. They call it Torsion. It's the same energy as subtle energy. What they say is that whenever elementary particles change their spin, and I'll stop for a second because Normally our Western physics talks about particles, atoms, protons, neutrons, etc. Every one of those particles has a spin. It spins around an axis, just like the Earth spins around the North Pole, just the way a child's top spins around when you crank the handle up and down. So every particle spins in the same way. It has an axis of spin. What the Russians found is when that spin axis changes, it creates a wave, a force, that's a wave of twisting that travels through the universe. They call that torsion. It's the same energy that healers are sending long distance when you're doing healing, and they've been able to prove that in the laboratory. And so now there are the first rudimentary machines that are able to measure this energy, and they've been doing experiments with it for the past several decades. So what they found is that when Einstein, for example, did his theory of gravity, which is what all Westerners consider to be the Bible, he left out this twisting force. He assumed that space can bend, but he did not assume it can twist. When you put in the twist, that's where the torsion is. So it's a really momentous discovery in physics that needs to be part of the physics textbooks, and that's sort of the shortest answer I can give you.
Okay. Any thoughts on how this torsion impacts us, or maybe even changes the model that physicists use to describe the universe, or Einstein's theory, or?
Yeah, there's two answers there in terms of us as humans, in terms of healing and health. It is the energy field that energy healers work with. I mean, you'll 30 or 40 years ago, the German scientists discovered biophotons, that the DNA, the big molecules in our cells that control our genetics, produce these little pulses of light called biophotons. And they play a very important part in how the body governs itself, how the cells communicate, and things like that. And if you read, many of the new popular books, Bruce Lipton, things like that, they'll talk about the biophotons, because biophotons are really pulses of light. They're quantum particles. We know how to detect them. They're light. Light sensors can pick them up. They're very weak, however. Most of them stay inside the body. They play an important role inside the body, but outside the body, they're almost all stopped. They don't get out of the body. If you look at experiments such as Gary Schwartz has done at the University of Arizona, you have to go to a dark room, a very, very sensitive detector. You see a few of these little biophotons coming out of the body, and you can measure those. But they don't play a very important part, in my opinion, in energy healing. Outside the body, it's this torsion field that plays the important role. And it answers questions like how is it able to send this energy long distances? If this were light energy, it would take a huge amount of energy to send it 1,000 miles. You'd have to light up like a lighthouse to send enough energy to get any, at the end point of your patient where he's located. But this torsion field acts very differently, and it's possible to focus it over large distances. So it looks like the torsion field is really the answer to what is the energy in energy medicine. It makes up the aura. It makes up the chakras. So the trick is, if we want to be able to have a science of energy medicine, to be able to measure the chakras, to measure the aura, we need good detectors of the torsion field. In terms of the physics, it also looks like it probably is a very, very important force that has been overlooked until now. In physics, the smallest things we talk about are the quantum. We talk about quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and a lot of times people will try to explain energy healing in terms of quantum physics. Mostly quantum things end at the size of the atom. Quantum physics works really well in describing the atom. And you may think that's small, but there are 20 orders of magnitude of things that are smaller than that still could exist in our universe. And it's that much, much smaller level, things that are smaller than the atom, that go down to what's called the Planck length, which is the smallest thing that can exist in our universe. That's where this torsion field appears to be most important. So it appears to be something that kind of underlies quantum physics. And when we get that figured out, we'll be able to explain quantum physics not as the deepest level of science, but as something that results from the way this torsion field behaves. Anyway,
and you
that was
said
too complicated. Please stop me and ask me questions if I went too fast there. But for me, it's very exciting because if you want to understand things at the deepest level, how things really fit together, it appears as though this torsion field is a really important component that we need to include if we really want to have a comprehensive theory of physics.
See, I have decided that I'm going to leave physics to physicists, and I'm just going to stay out of that whole game because I still don't know if the cat is dead or not, and I don't know how one light beam turns into two. And
Did you look? Did you look in the box?
Wait, no, I have a question about that later.
Sure, okay.
Well, not really, but kind of. I have an official physics question, but I'm not quite there yet because this torsion thing is really interesting. And
yeah.
you said that they actually have created devices to detect the shifting of the electron.
Yeah, what the Russians have, the problem is we don't have the full story on torsion. Apparently, there was a fairly intense program going on in Russia for several decades, starting in the 1950s, to do research on this. We heard a little bit about it in the West. If you go back and read the classic book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, by Ostrander and Schroeder, came out about 1970, and then there was a reissue in the 90s. This was a book by two ladies who went over to Eastern Europe and Russia in 1969 and talked to a lot of Russian scientists. And much to their surprise, the Russians took paranormal phenomena very seriously, and they were doing, scientific studies on it. And so this book was a real blockbuster because it interviewed a lot of the top scientists at that time and had references, and it was a gold mine of information. And I think it changed a lot of people's minds in this country about how real the paranormal things really are. But one of the people they interviewed was a man named Nikolai Kozyrev, who even at that time was a distinguished scientist. And their whole chapter about him is about the nature of time. They said that this man has figured out what time really is, and it all involves the flow of this thing they call torsion. And they say I had a whole chapter about this man. They went to his laboratory, he showed them experiments, showed them demonstrations. It's really fascinating. Well, it turns out the Russian government, after that, heavily supported research. There were dozens and dozens of scientists, big national labs working on this stuff. When glasnost and perestroika happened, when the Russian Soviet socialist republics fell apart, and Russia changed its form of government in 1991 with glasnost and perestroika, a lot of those scientists became free to talk about what they were doing. And they wrote papers, and the Internet had a lot of publications, and so most of what we know came from that time period. And unfortunately, their policy changed a few years later, and it dried up. And today it's much more tight than it was at that time. But what they showed us is that there was a big program, a big scientific program to investigate this force, and theories developed. And so as part of that, there were devices developed. They don't tell us everything you'd like to know about the devices. They say there are some phenomena, some physical things that change when torsion is present, and you can use them. And in my book, in chapter 7 and 8 of my book, I talk a lot about torsion. There's about 100 pages there. My book is Life Force is a big book, 720 pages, and two of the chapters are about torsion and its applications. And I talk about some of the devices that respond to torsion, but they still probably aren't the best ones. One of the ways that we know responds to torsion is called Kirlian photography. And you may know there's a camera called the GDV, the gas discharge visualization system, invented by Korotkov, which is one way they use Kirlian photography, which is the spark images that you make when you put your fingers on a photograph with a high voltage. So that responds to torsion. So when you see these big auras around people on a Kirlian photograph, that really is because of the torsion field there. So that's one way of seeing the effects of torsion.
I had a question about Kirlian photography because you were talking about the biophotons. Is that what's actually being measured in the Kirlian photograph?
Boy, no. That's a good question.
You could say no.
No is probably the right answer there. Biophotons are produced by the DNA molecules in your cells, and they're little photons that are waves like little pulses of light that DNA uses to communicate with the other molecules in the cell to tell it what to do, and it also communicates with other DNA molecules to tell them what to do, to coordinate. So that is primarily the primary effect of biophotons, in my opinion.
Well, because you were talking about they don't really leave the body, and when someone puts their finger onto one of those Kirlian plates,
right?
Most of the time, the halo around the finger isn't that great. I mean, there's a little bit. But I have worked at different shows where there's someone with a Kirlian camera next to me, and I'll do, they'll do before and after, and so I'll have somebody come over and they'll take their picture of their finger, and actually I've had them take a picture of my finger. Mine just looks, whatever, but theirs might be because they don't feel well. It looks, pretty minimal. And then I will do a session on the person, and theirs looks better, but then mine just is kind of huge. So that's why I thought, well, maybe it was our body emitting it while we were in a torsion state. It could happen.
Yeah, I think that's pretty close to the right answer. In my book, I go through a lot of the different aspects of the body, of the physiology or the biology of the body, because when we're talking about healing and how energy healing works, it's important to kind of look at the different components of the body and understand, this whole a new picture is emerging of what a living system is, and that's part of what I try to talk about in the book. When I went to school with biology and chemistry, and we kind of were taught, well, DNA has these molecules, and it makes other molecules called proteins, and the pattern of these chemicals. It's all about chemicals and about atoms combining together to make certain structures that make your liver and different parts of your body. But the big question that they could not answer is, the cells in every part of your body have the same DNA. There's the same DNA in your fingernails, in your eyeballs, in your liver, in your nerve cells. How is it that the DNA knows to make different proteins so that the liver looks different from the toenail? It has to know where it is in the body to know how to change its behavior, and it's all the same chemical pattern throughout the body, and that's been one of the big mysteries. And Biophotons, which was the subject of that was developed in Germany really over the past 30 years, answered part of that because it's a way for the DNA to communicate one with the other. But what they found is there's something more to it, that the DNA actually acts like a laser. The DNA in different parts of the body becomes coherent. The cells talk to each other. The DNA actually form a hologram inside your body, which is a pattern of energy that enables each DNA molecule in different parts of your body to tell where it is in the overall picture. So the DNA can tell, I'm in the liver, I'm in the finger, because it can actually pick up and receive this hologram and tell which part of the hologram it's located in, and that determines the kinds of proteins it produces. So this is a pretty revolutionary idea that has answered this long-standing question. But then the other part is that the biophotons have to stay pretty much inside the body because they are the energy. When you say you're low in energy, by and large, your biophoton level has been depleted. The biophotons it acts much like a laser. In fact, it really is a biolaser. And to be able to function in a healthy, successful way, you have to keep the energy pumped up. In a laser, it's the many, many photons together that pull other photons into the same state that allows the laser to operate. If you lose too many photons, the laser stops lasing, and we call that the dead state. The only difference between a alive and a dead living organism is the biophoton level that's existing in the cells. So we want to keep our biophoton level up in the body. So that's the problem with energy healing, that if it were based on biophotons, you'd have to give away too many. I mean, the healer would die, basically, if you try to give enough biophotons to affect someone at a long distance. So that's really part of the mystery of long-range healing. And the answer appears to be this torsion field, that most of the biophotons kind of reflect internally in the body. They stay within the body, and they stay in this coherent, laser-like state. But every time they bounce inside the body, they produce a torsion field that hovers around the body, forming the aura, and radiates, making it possible to link in with someone at a distance, because the torsion waves and the biophotons are actually coupled to each other. But the biophotons have a lot more energy than the torsion does. I'm trying to say kind of a complicated piece here quickly, and I apologize for that. The book lays it out in a step-by-step fashion with a lot of detail, but there really is now a coherent picture for how the body as an energy system functions, how it maintains itself. When you have an injury, for example, when you cut your arm, the cells locally in that part of the arm have to know, what kind of protein is this? What kind of tissue am I supposed to be making? And that's where this template, this holographic template comes in. That's what tells the cells how to do what they do. So all this fits together in kind of a new image of what life really is. It's really the secret of life, and it's about energy. And my book really is about what the nature of that energy really is, and trying to connect it with the science of it. So there are a lot of little pieces here that I'm trying to explain kind of quickly, and I apologize for that. But the book does it in more detail.
We'll fix it. Just buy the book. Just buy the book. Life Force, the scientific basis.
Yeah, exactly. And the book has now become a textbook at the California Institute for Human Studies in Encinitas. It's the first college that's adopted it as a textbook now. So we're going to be doing teaching energy healers about the science that underlies energy medicine.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm still kind of stuck on that device thing that you were talking about.
And
I have one more question. Right. I think one more question. Because you were saying that you learned about the device from literature that came out of Russia. And I'm kind of jumping fields here a little bit, and I hope I don't sound too devil advocate like a devil's advocate here. But in the ghost hunting world, which I know you've done some investigating into that field as well,
right. Yep.
They have things like the K2 meter and the Frank's box, and there are people that use them that actually believe that they work, and then there's another big piece of the community that think they're a bunch of hooey and fake. Is there any possibility that the device that it was actually measuring these torsion fields was fake?
The device measuring the torsion fields. You mean in Russia?
And their studies, could it have been wishful thinking on their part?
Well, in the late 90s, after the Russian government began changing again, they initially, after Glasnost and Perestroika, they were very open for several years. Then they began taking it back. They began, I think, being sorry that they'd given out so much, and there was some debunking that went on the internet about torsion and some of this research, and trying to say, hey, don't look at this stuff. It's like it was just all a bunch of hooey. Just forget about it. And so what I've done in a very careful way is look at how many scientists have been involved in doing torsion research, and for how long. And that's why it's so important to go back to the psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain book, 1970. What you find then at that time is that Nikolai Kozyrev had been working on this since the 50s. He published papers about it. There were other papers by other scientists in Russia that confirmed what he found. I mean, they confirmed remarkable things. One of the things they confirmed, they developed a detector for torsion using tungsten resistors and made a telescope from this, a real simple telescope that you point at the sun and you can look at the torsion being emitted from the sun. You put a cover over this thing to keep out light and heat and all the conventional kinds of energy, and they could still see the sun just based on the torsion emitted from the sun. But the remarkable thing about their experiment is that they didn't see the sun in one place in the sky. Normally we see the sun, optically with our eyes at the place in the sky where it appears to be, given the fact that light travels at a finite speed, the speed of light. It takes 8.3 minutes for light to get from the sun to us, and that causes the sun to appear in a little bit different place in the sky than it would if light traveled at infinite speed. Well, what they saw is that with their torsion, the sun appeared in three places in the sky. It appeared at the place you would normally expect it, based on a signal traveling the speed of light. They got another image at a place where you would see it if the signal traveled at infinite speed. And they saw another image where you would expect to see it if the signal traveled backwards in time. So if that doesn't blow your mind, nothing will. So they got three images from the sun in this torsion detection system. And these were all, 30, 40 years ago we're talking about, and these were in refereed international journals. If you go back and start looking at who has been doing research on torsion in Russia, there are dozens, if not hundreds of scientists who published papers and did work and worked at various institutions in that country over many, many years. So I tend to take the work very seriously. I think it's quite real, and I think the efforts to debunk it that came along recently are, it's their effort to try to get us to, to not pay attention to it. So anyway, that's my opinion.
Okay. And it wasn't about debunking it as much as, talking about the device, but I guess if you are, having peer-reviewed literature and working in a lab, you're not going to be sitting there with a K2 meter going, ooh, I'm detecting your subtle energy. Anyway, let's just move along.
I think the devices that can detect torsion, I'm not an expert on the different devices used by ghost hunters, but one thing we do know
basically it's a EM meter with a light on it. It's crap.
Well, one of the things about subtle energy fields, or the energies that ghosts produce, the astral energies, they often do affect physical fields like electromagnetism. It doesn't mean that ghost has a magnetic field or he has an electric field, but the way I think about it is that it's the torsion field that sort of holds together that consciousness. Also has other effects. It is actually changing the nature of space-time, and therefore has other signatures like electric and magnetic that we could detect. But they work some of the time, and sometimes they don't. I'm hoping that as we learn more about torsion and how to detect it, maybe we can have better detectors for ghost hunters someday.
Mm-hmm. That would be very cool. I'm going to kind of shift gears. Right? No more questions about the device, I promise.
Well,
when
let me
I
just say,
think...
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Real quickly, before you pass on to something else, I think a really good torsion detection device is much needed. From my book, you'll find that there are 7 or 8 different technologies that we can use to detect torsion, and lots of experiments have been published that show that it does respond. So to me, the scientific issue is closed, but to get our Western scientists to take this stuff seriously, we need a good torsion meter that works like electromagnetic sensors do, that is quick and fast and gives a strong signal, and we don't have those yet. And I think if we ever do, that will solve this debate for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. I'll agree. When I think of subtle energy, life force energy, and energy work, one of the things that I'm a big advocate around is the use of intention to support the shifting of energy. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do.
The power of intention?
Yeah, it's very real, and it does have a strong effect. I talk about this some in the book. It's something that is kind of left out of Western science, but what appears to be the case is that our consciousness really is closely tied in with the torsion field, and the images in our mind, the state of consciousness, is intimately tied with torsion. And when we form a thought or an image, you could see it. I believe. I think someday we'll be able to prove this in the form of the torsion field around the body. So, for example, real simple idea, and Hal Puthoff, one of the creators of the remote viewing program, one of the scientists who's been heavily involved with paranormal types of research as a physicist, says, if you just imagine something, if you visualize a blue sphere in front of your face, that he believes the odds are increased that a blue sphere will appear there. That when our imagination, we call it imagination, an image in our mind, forms, that actually changes the nature of space-time around us and makes it more likely that certain things will happen. And I think the mechanism that makes that happen is this torsion field. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but I'm trying.
Well, that does. But see, it leads me to my almost real physics question.
Uh-huh.
I had to write it down because I had to think about it for a second. Even though, again, not a physics person per se, but I know you'll know where I'm going. Okay, so in physics they say that the observer affects the outcome of an experiment. So is it the subtle energy of the observer that is actually impacting the particle movement during these experiments? See, isn't that a good physics question?
That's a very good physics question. Let's see. I try to answer.
I'm sorry,
that.
I don't mean to make such hard questions.
No, it's okay. That's where the frontier is. That's where we can learn new things. Right now, there's a lot of people who try to, I would say, almost brush off paranormal and energy phenomena by saying there's something called quantum entanglement, that our wave, and most of them have not had courses in quantum physics, and most people haven't had courses in quantum physics, but quantum entanglement kind of occurs, basically there's an idea called a wave function, that a wave function really governs how a particle behaves. You never really know where the particle is, but the wave function kind of tells you in probability where it's most likely to be, etc. And in quantum physics, these wave functions, when they overlap, you can have particles that become entangled, they interact with each other, and you get these effects called entanglement. And there are efforts now underway to try to make quantum computers that use quantum entanglement. The problem is that for most energy healing work, scientifically, you need really strong wave functions, really strong signals, really strong likelihoods of quantum effects being present to make these things work. And most healers are working with clients who are far away in very noisy situations that don't really match up with this whole idea of quantum entanglement very well. What I talk about in my book is a different model where, because the torsion waves can travel both forward and backward in time, you can focus them at a distance, the same way you can form a hologram and focus it somewhere else. So anyway, I know I'm getting a little complicated here, and I apologize, I'm trying to think of a simple answer to your question. I would just say read the book. Chapter 13 is where we talk about consciousness and how, well, let me give you one example that tells you how deep a question this is. There are healers, and Richard Bartlett, who's Matrix Energetics, is one example, but there are old healing traditions in the kahunas in Hawaii, shaman in North America, who often heal instantaneously. And the way they would describe what they do is they take you into a parallel universe where the injury never occurred. And so you have a bone that's broken, all of a sudden, snap your fingers, it's healed. And that should be impossible by our Western scientific paradigm, but by their explanation, they shift parallel realities. And I know that really sounds far out, and yet there's a lot of evidence now that these things actually happen. And in my model that I describe in the last chapter of the book, I show how that actually fits in a very natural way with consciousness and the way consciousness affects physics. So I'll leave it there.
Okay. What kind of, we've talked a number of times about energy healing. What kinds of experiments have they done? If you could just kind of give us a little brief sampling, and then maybe some of the results that they've discovered or conclusions that they've come to with some different modalities of energy healing.
Sure. The thing that I talk about most in the book, I have a whole chapter or maybe two chapters on the Qigong masters of China.
Mm-hmm.
Who in China, this is a traditional form of healing, thousands of years old. There's a wonderful book by Hong Lu, doctor, MD, both Chinese medicine as well as American medicine, who talks about how he learned to do Qigong. He went to study with a master in southern China. This master lived in a cave. He lived in a cave without a telephone. Everything was telepathic. Everything was remote. He did all of his healing with his clients all around China from thousands of miles away. When he worked with a client, in his mind, he could see the client. He could see the energy field of the client. It was like a hologram in front of him. He could work with it. He could watch it change. I have other friends in America who do the same type of thing. But when you're good, a lot of things are possible that our Western science, can't even begin to understand. So this fellow worked in a cave and worked long distance. The Chinese have since then done studies of what are the effects of Qigong. They find that people with cancer surgery, they heal much faster after the surgery when Qigong is included as part of the regimen. There are experiments that I talk about in the book. One Qigong master did an experiment in America where he sent his Qi from California to Penn State University in Pennsylvania. A professor there had an incubator, like a warm box with little petri dishes, each one of which had cancer cells in it. The cancer cells grow, they expand, they were on a little medium, they grow quite rapidly, of course, left alone. Then he would ask the Qigong master from 2,000 miles away, okay, send your energy to the petri dish on the top shelf in the middle. And all of a sudden, those cells would start to die, and the other cells would be left alone. So this man could send his Qi thousands of miles, aimed within a few centimeters, and kill cancer cells at will in the desired area. Another experiment carried out by Professor Joey Jones, University of California, involved Qigong masters, they call them pranic healers, that were working on cells that had been injured from radiation. They put them in a high radiation background that would kill about half the cells in 24 hours. Then they asked the healers, okay, can you heal these cells? And they found that they could. In different, either sending energy before the radiation or after the radiation or before and after, they got the survival rate from 50% up to 88%. Over 10 years, they've been doing this experiment hundreds and hundreds of times. Very consistent results. Definite healing, 88%. Professor Jones was troubled. He said, well, there must be something missing. Why is it not 100%? And then he got the idea, maybe it's karma, the karma of the cells. In the next experiment, he had his lab assistant make a phone call to a charity and make a contribution, a credit card contribution to the charity with the intention that the good karma from his generous act would go to the cells. And the survival rate went from 88% to 96%. And that's been duplicated over 100 times since then. So he proved that even karma is a part of the healing process. So it's experiments like this that are helping us understand what's involved with healing and how the life force or chi seems to work. So anyway, those are some of the foundational experiments. I also talk about the German scientists Roman Reichenbach and more recently Wilhelm Reich, who did a lot of experiments with the same energy. We have a lot of different ways of looking at this energy by now, and so the picture is becoming pretty firm. And that was one of the important pieces for me in understanding the Russian work, because it's actually consistent with other scientists in the West who have looked at the same energy, so we can actually see correlations between different scientists.
I really like that whole concept of, I mean, not necessarily about the making the donation to the charity, but that he did something, you know, I'm a big intention person, you know, he did something with the intention of creating some kind of an effect. You know, are you familiar with Dr. Emoto's work?
Absolutely.
And with the water?
Sure. Yep.
I mean, you know, it kind of goes along with that whole line, and I'll leave it to you. I mean, if you could explain to the listeners about his work just briefly.
Sure. One of the things we've been finding, and let me maybe take it one step back from Dr. Emoto specifically, that this torsion field really interacts with the spins of particles. And it's something that's been left out, by and large, for most of physics. We think of DNA and the biochemistry of the body as mostly atoms combining with atoms, what we call chemistry. It appears as though the spins of the particles is much more important than we realized. There have been, take homeopathy, for example, as a practice, where you take a molecule that's bioactive, that has some effect on the body, then you mix it with water, you dilute it. Over and over, you dilute it down to where there's no more of that chemical left. But you do it in a very special way, so there's some imprint of that chemical still left in the water. And so the homeopathic remedy, which only is water chemically, but has some pattern, still has a biological effect. And, of course, Jacques Ben-Beniste in the 1980s and 90s got into big trouble. He's a very eminent scientist, but he published a paper in Nature proving this effect really worked. And he was destroyed within a few years by the community that went up in arms about, you know, his discoveries. But this is a very ancient practice, and there are other people since then have shown that these patterns can be impressed in water even when the chemicals aren't there. Well, it appears to be the spin patterns, the spins of the hydrogen and the oxygen molecules in the water that is carrying the information. That's what the Russians are saying. And the torsion field is able to create that spin pattern, and it can also couple to that spin pattern. So the torsion field, you know, is really a part and parcel of this importance of spin. So it may well be that we humans, that in our bodies, it's not just the chemicals, but it's the spin patterns in the body that really play an important role in who we are and how we function. And so when we put a spin pattern into water, then that water has a strong effect. It'll affect how it crystallizes, which is what Emoto was seeing, but it also tells you why the mind is so good at imposing a pattern on the water, because the torsion field from our energy field is very good at creating torsion and these spin patterns in the water. So I'm not sure if that helps at all, but it's you know, there's so much fascinating stuff here, and we're at a frontier. I have a quote in my book from one of the top Chinese scientists, one of the most eminent scientists. He's one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California at JPL before he immigrated back to China. But he has looked at all this work and says, you know, this is a revolution. This is a revolution in physics, and it needs to be studied.
Do you think, let me just tell you, we have about 4 minutes, okay?
Okay.
Do you think that mainstream science, and I'm going to even go one step further, healthcare, will look at this and start to embrace it as something that maybe could be real?
Well, you know, I used to wonder about the myth of Prometheus, who in Greek mythology, he brought light to man, and in thanks for that, they tied him to a rock for 1,000 years, and the eagles could peck out his innards, And why is it that oftentimes the light bringers get punished in this way for their good deeds? And the problem is you're always changing a paradigm. You're always upsetting somebody. Somebody has a vested interest in the current way of doing things. In this case, it might be pharmaceuticals, it might be physicists who learn a certain way in school. There's always somebody who has to change, and change is not easy. So the way I see it, what seems to be happening is because healthcare in America is so expensive right now, and because our current medicine is not very effective toward lots of things, autoimmune diseases, a lot of chronic diseases, people are looking for alternatives. So they look to alternative healers, and therefore they go to homeopathy, they go to energy medicine, and then what the Chinese are saying as well is that those methods are often more effective for those kinds of illnesses. So the optimum healthcare system is one that embraces both, and you have to pick the right type of medicine for the type of illness that you have. But these chronic illnesses, I think, they respond very well to energy approaches.
Okay.
And so I think, eventually, but the way I see it is that eventually it's going to be integrated, but it may be a slow process, and it'll happen more by the voting of individuals probably, and then the larger system may be somewhat slow in coming around.
Well, I think the individuals have been voting with their pocketbooks for a long time.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, we have just under 2 minutes. Any last thoughts, words, comments, ideas you'd like to share with the listeners? And I have to tell you, this was way too short of a period of time, and so I would love to have you back, and we can come up with some other topics to talk about.
I'd be delighted. The quick final thought would be that what we're learning about is with this torsion field is the connection between the spiritual side of us. The astral body, the aura, the chakras. These are things that communicate with higher dimensions. They enable us to, I believe, to talk telepathically to one another. We can talk with our spirit guides. The Akashic record, which is part of the Indian traditional mythology, if you like, which is that the idea that all the images of all events which ever happened in the universe are saved somewhere and you can access them. It appears as though the torsion field is probably the medium that stores that information. So what we're seeing now is a possibility of transitioning from a materialistic physics to a physics that embraces spirituality, embraces the power of consciousness, and helps integrate and merge these two different sides of ourselves, the scientific and the spiritual. So that's what I think is going on.
Just a little teeny quick question. So do you consider yourself a spiritual person, or have you had paranormal experiences yourself?
I do to both, although typically people who have a lot of left brain training and a lot of analytical training, it's harder to let that part down, to open up the mind to those events. But with some training, yes, and I have had some pretty modest compared to a lot of people I know. But I'm working on it. I took 3 courses in remote viewing, and so when you do that, you gives you the chance in your own mind to experience things that happened at other places and times. So that's an example.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. I like it. And let's see, your webpage is?
Is www.synchronizeduniverse.com. And synchronized is spelled with a Z. Or the easy way, just put my name, Claude Swanson, into Google, and the website pops up first.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Claude. And we'll have you back because I feel like we just talked about one topic and we have like a million more to talk about. So.
I look forward to it. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Claude. That was Claude Swanson. His book, Life Force, The Scientific Basis. His website, thesynchronizeduniverse.com. And next week, we're going to be speaking to Carrie Lynn Cassidy behind Project Camelot. And in the second hour, to Maxine Taylor about discovering your life mission. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita.